So the cause of the epidemic is the overconsumption of addictive high-carbohydrate foods by large numbers of individuals with varying degrees of insulin resistance. That is my conclusion after 3 years of studying the literature. And I think the evidence is absolutely clear for it, as I'll try to show. So let's take a step back by looking at how do people explain why you get fat. And so there are two models of obesity, and the first model is the energy balance model, which says that calories in exceed calories out, you will put on weight. And that, of course, is true, but it's meaningless. Because we have to understand, why do people take in more calories if we want to understand the model? The model is no better than telling an alcoholic he's drinking too much alcohol. We know that. The question is why? And the problem with the energy balance model is it doesn't answer the question why. And if we try to use it to get people to lose weight, it really doesn't work. The better model, in my view, is called the failed homeostat model, in which addictive food choices cause obesity in those with carbohydrate insulin resistance. And I'll show you that when you apply this model, then you can really get people to lose weight. So let's look at Model 1. Model 1 simply states that if your energy intake exceeds your energy expenditure, you will gain weight. And that is absolutely true. And people who are fat have to increase their energy intake. We're not contesting that. What we're saying is that this model doesn't help us treat the disease. So what we say then is that people who gain weight are slothful and gluttonous. If they just do more exercise and eat less, they would lose weight. The problem is that the model doesn't work. So this is what the model predicts. Calories ingested are greater than calories expended as a result of individual sloth and gluttony. So all you have to do is count calories and develop a negative calorie balance. You must ingest fewer calories, expend more calories in physical activity. And the outcome is it fails in most subjects. We know that. This method just simply doesn't work. So what do we conclude? We conclude that obesity, diabetes, and as a consequence, the metabolic syndrome is incurable. And when we see people like this, we just throw our hands up and say, there's nothing we can do for you because you are so gluttonous that we can't help you. Now, the reason why this is all wrong is because obesity cannot be due simply to doing too little exercise. And the answer is simple. We have a homeostat, or an apostat in the brain, which actively controls how much exercise we do and how much we eat. And under the control conditions for 3.5 million years, it kept us lean perfectly, as it keeps those lions lean that I showed you earlier. Lions don't overeat in the wild. They don't get fat. And the answer is because the brain controller works perfectly. So in a homeostatically regulated system, any reduction in daily energy expenditure will be matched by an identical reduction in energy intake. And incidentally, it's calculated that the obesity epidemic in the United States is because they're now eating 100 calories more than they're expending. Now, if it's only 100 calories more, all they have to do was do a tiny little more exercise or eat a tiny little bit less, and no one would be fat. But the reality is they aren't. And so the homeostat is failing because it could easily get people to do 100 calories more exercise. It could easily get people to do 100 calories, eat less, 100 calories less. But it hasn't succeeded in doing that because something else is damaging the system. So the damage to the homeostat has to be the root cause of the obesity epidemic after 1977. And so the reason why this model fails is because it's brainless, and no one puts the brain in. And once you put the brain in, you understand that the key problem in obesity is the overconsumption of calories caused by uncontrollable hunger. That's the key to obesity. And we are living today as a population that is always hungry, and that's why we're always eating every 3 hours. And that is not the way we were designed. Lions do not eat every 3 hours. They eat every 3 or 4 days. And in my view, that's when humans were carnivores, they were probably eating every 2 or 3 days as well. And that's how our physiology is designed, for intermittent fasting. We should be fasting more than we should be eating. And the problem is because we don't understand how to control our hunger. And it's the uncontrolled hunger that is the cause of the obesity. So the question is, what is driving the uncontrollable hunger that is in consequence driving the obesity epidemic? Well, Ann Stock and John Yudkin in 1970 published this paper, and the opening sentence is particularly interesting. It says, in Britain, many people have found that the low-carbohydrate diet is a satisfactory way of treating overweight. It is the choice of a majority of British physicians, which is really interesting in the 1970s. that the British physicians were using this diet. Now what Stock and Yudkin did was that they collected 11 subjects and they changed their diet, firstly from the traditional high carbohydrate diet, then to a high fat diet. And the point was that they said you must eat to hunger. You must eat as much as you like so you're not hungry on either diet. And then they checked what had changed in the diet. So on the left we have eating the normal diet, and these subjects were eating 2,300 calories. They then went on the low carbohydrate diet and they started eating only 1,500 calories, which was a difference of over 7,000 calories, which was about 30%. So remember that these people are eating to hunger, yet when they ate the low carbohydrate diet, they were not hungry despite the fact that they were eating 30% less calories. And now we compare, the protein intake was exactly the same on both diets. The fat was actually a little less on the low carbohydrate diet, but the real change was in the carbohydrate intake from 216 grams to 67 grams. So what this shows is that eating carbohydrates drives your appetite. It doesn't satisfy it. And that is really interesting, because you would normally think that the more calories you eat, the less hunger you have. But what it shows here is if those calories are carbohydrate, they will overstimulate you to eat more. And that's what's happened in the United States of America. Increased carbohydrate consumption, increased intake of calories. And so what the authors wrote, in conformity with our experience with this diet during the last 15 years, none of our subjects complained of hunger or any other ill effects. On the other hand, several volunteered statements to the effect that an increased feeling of well-being and decreased lassitude. And that's what people have noticed, that when you go on this diet, you just feel better. So the second model of obesity is the one in which I put the brain right at the center and said, addictive foods come along and they cause you to overconsume calories. So you increase your energy intake. And as you get fatter, you become less active and your energy output is reduced. Now the point about the energy that you take in, it is partitioned in the body. And it's partitioned, either it's stored as fat or it's expended as energy. And the difference is determined, what it does is determined by the insulin concentrations, habitual insulin concentrations. And the more insulin you secrete, the more you store as fat, because insulin is the fat building hormone. Without insulin, you cannot become fat. It's the single driver of obesity. So you store your energy as fat, and once you store too much energy as fat and you have persistently high insulin concentrations, you're constantly hungry, always looking for food, and you have decreased activity. But the point is that your energy intake and the type of food that you eat determines your insulin response. And the more carbohydrates you have and the more carbohydrate insulin resistant you are, the higher your insulin concentrations. So this model predicts that if you eat lots of carbohydrates and you're insulin resistant, you will convert most of the energy in the diet to fat, and it will be stuck in the fat cells. You'll be constantly hungry and you'll have decreased activity. So this model states that obesity weight gain requires the presence of a functioning pancreas. If your pancreas is not present, you will not become fat, and we know that. So hormones, insulin especially, are involved, and carbohydrates specifically stimulate insulin production on the most likely drivers of weight gain, obesity. So how do you prevent obesity according to this model? Well, firstly, you count the grams of carbohydrates per day, not calories. It's the grams of carbohydrate. You restrict your carbohydrates to less than 50 grams per day, less if you're more severely ill with hypertension or diabetes or obesity. And the outcome is that this is the most effective weight loss results of any dietary intervention. It's repeatedly proven in my view. And the conclusion then is, if you follow this model, we can say obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome are curable if specific simple rules are followed.